37,000 feet above ground. And Jalen had never felt more alone. His 8-month-old daughter, Mira, was screaming. That raw, desperate kind of cry that makes strangers stare and mothers look away. Sweat dripped down his temple. His hands shook. Every passenger in rows 12 through 18 was glaring, whispering, judging. A man in a business suit muttered something about controlling your kid. A flight attendant approached with that tight smile that meant trouble. Jalen closed his eyes, pulled Mira closer, and whispered the only words he knew. "I'm sorry, baby. Daddy's trying." Then she appeared. A woman from the row across stood up without a word. She didn't ask permission. She simply reached out, lifted Mira from his trembling arms, and did something no stranger should ever do. The cabin went silent. Jalen's heart stopped. And what happened next would haunt him for 8 months until he finally understood why she did it. The red-eye flight from Ridgeport to Hion Bay was supposed to be simple. Jalen had planned everything down to the minute. The feeding schedule, the diaper bag packed with military precision, the white noise app downloaded on his phone. He had read every article, watched every video, asked every single dad in his support group for advice. 8 months of solo parenting had taught him that preparation was the only thing standing between him and complete disaster. But Mira had other plans. She started fussing somewhere over Nebraska. By the time they crossed into Wyoming airspace, the fussing had turned into full-blown wailing. Jalen tried the bottle. She pushed it away. He tried the pacifier. She spat it out. He tried rocking, bouncing, humming every lullaby he could remember from his own childhood. Nothing worked. Jalen felt the familiar weight of shame pressing down on his chest. He knew what the other passengers were thinking. He could see it in the way the woman in front of him kept sighing dramatically. In the way the elderly couple across the aisle exchanged knowing glances. They were thinking what everyone always thought when they saw him alone with Mira. That he was doing it wrong. That a baby needed her mother, and he was just a poor substitute trying his best. They weren't entirely wrong. 8 months ago, Jalen had no idea how to change a diaper. 8 months ago, he couldn't tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. 8 months ago, his wife Ilara was supposed to be here doing all the things that seemed to come so naturally to mothers. But Ilara had held Mira exactly once, for 37 seconds in the delivery room, before the hemorrhaging started, before the doctor stopped smiling, before Jalen's entire world collapsed into a single, devastating sentence. We did everything we could. Now here he was, alone on a plane with a screaming baby, and no idea what to do next. The flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, that practiced smile fixed on her face like a warning. That's when the woman stood up. She was sitting in the row across from him, window seat. She had dark skin and natural hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and tired eyes that suggested she hadn't slept in days. There was a little girl curled up beside her, maybe 4 years old, fast asleep against the window with a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The woman didn't look at Jalen. She didn't ask if he needed help. She simply stood, crossed the narrow aisle, and held out her arms. "Give her to me," she said. It wasn't a question. Jalen's first instinct was to refuse. Strangers didn't just take other people's babies. But something in her voice, a quiet authority that seemed to come from a place deeper than politeness, made him hesitate. And in that moment of hesitation, the woman reached down and lifted Mira from his arms as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The cabin fell silent. Everyone watched as this stranger cradled Jalen's daughter against her chest and began to hum, low and soft. A melody that sounded like something between a lullaby and a prayer. She swayed gently from side to side, her eyes closed, her lips moving as if she was having a conversation with Mira that no one else could hear. And then, impossibly, Mira stopped crying. Not gradually, not in fits and starts, but all at once. As if someone had flipped a switch, she let out one last shuddering sob, then nestled her face into the woman's neck and went still. Jalen watched in stunned disbelief as his daughter's tiny fingers curled around a strand of dark hair, holding on as if she had found something she had been searching for all along. The woman opened her eyes and looked at Jalen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, very quietly, she just wanted to be held by someone who wasn't afraid. Jalen didn't know what to say to that, so he just sat there, watching this stranger rock his daughter to sleep, and wondered how she could possibly know what Mira needed when he, her own father, had been failing for the past 3 hours. The flight attendant retreated back toward the galley, as if she had witnessed something too intimate to interrupt. The other passengers slowly returned to their books and phones, the tension draining from the cabin. "I'm Leora," the woman said, settling into the empty seat beside Jalen. Mira was already asleep, her breathing slow and even against Leora's collarbone. "And before you ask, no, I'm not some baby whisperer. I just remember what it feels like." What feels like?" Jalen asked. Leora's eyes drifted to the window, where the darkness outside was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn. Being so tired that you can't see straight. Feeling like everyone is watching you fail. Wondering if you're ever going to figure out how to do this. She paused. "I spent the first year of my daughter's life convinced that I was the worst mother in the world. Turns out I was just the only one trying." Jalen glanced at the little girl still sleeping across the aisle. She had Leora's dark skin and natural curls, but her face was softer, with a kind of peaceful expression that only children can manage in sleep. "Her father?" he asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, that's none of my business." "It's fine," Leora said, though something in her jaw tightened. "He left when Suri was 6 months old, said he wasn't ready to be a dad." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "My mom was the only one who helped me. She moved in, took care of Suri while I worked, held me together when I was falling apart." Leora's voice cracked slightly. "She died last week. Heart attack. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. This flight is us coming home from the funeral." Jalen felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went beyond sympathy. He knew that kind of loss. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything in a long time. "My wife died giving birth to Mira. She never got to hold her, not really. Just once, for a few seconds, and then..." He couldn't finish the sentence. He had never been able to finish that sentence. Leora turned to look at him, and for the first time, Jalen saw the full weight of exhaustion in her eyes. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying grief alone for so long that you forget what it feels like to put it down. "So, we're both doing this by ourselves," she said. "Yeah," Jalen said. "I guess we are." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky lighten outside the window. Mira slept on, completely unaware of the 2 broken people who were holding her up. Across the aisle, Suri stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about butterflies. "She talked about you," Leora said suddenly. Jalen frowned. "Who?" "Mira. Well, not talked, obviously. But when I was holding her, she kept looking at you. Even when she was crying, she was looking at you. Like she was making sure you were still there." Leora shifted Mira slightly. "She's not crying because you're doing something wrong, Jalen. She's crying because she knows how hard you're trying. Babies can feel that. The fear, the love, all of it. Jalen felt something hot and unexpected burning behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, turning toward the window. "My wife," he said, his voice rough. "She said something to me right before, right at the end. She said, 'Find someone who loves her like you love me.' I thought she was talking about Mira, about finding someone to help raise her. But now I think—" He stopped, unable to continue. "Now you think what?" Leora asked gently. Jalen shook his head. "I don't know. I don't know what I think anymore." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Hion Bay. The cabin lights flickered on, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Across the aisle, Suri's eyes fluttered open. "Mommy," she called out. Then she saw Jalen and Mira. "Mommy, there's a baby." Leora smiled, the first real smile Jalen had seen from her. "I know, sweetheart. This is Mira, and this is her daddy, Jalen." Suri studied Jalen with the serious intensity of a 4-year-old making an important assessment. "Why is he sad?" "He's not sad, baby. He's just tired, like us." Suri nodded as if it made perfect sense. "My grandma went to heaven," she announced to Jalen. "Mommy says she's watching us from the clouds. Do you think she can see the plane?" Jalen felt his throat tighten. "I think she can see everything. I think she's probably really proud of you and your mommy." Suri beamed. Then she pointed at Mira. "Is the baby going to cry again?" "I don't think so," Leora said, looking at Jalen. "I think she found what she needed." The plane touched down, and the cabin erupted into the usual chaos of deplaning. Jalen reached for Mira, and Leora handed her over carefully, their fingers brushing in the transfer. "Thank you," Jalen said. The words felt inadequate for what had just happened. "I know," Leora said, gathering Suri's things. "But I wanted to, and sometimes that's enough." Suri tugged at Jalen's sleeve. "Are you coming to our house? I have toys. I can show the baby my toys." Jalen looked at Leora, expecting her to redirect her daughter's invitation. Instead, she paused and met his eyes. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "For whatever this is, whatever it could be. I just buried my mother, and I'm barely holding it together, and I don't know if I can—" "I understand," Jalen said quickly. But Leora continued. "I work at a cafe, Haven Brew on Linden Avenue. Suri and I are there most mornings. If you ever want to—" She reached into her bag and pulled out a receipt, scribbling an address on the back. "No pressure, no expectations, just if you want to." Jalen took the paper and tucked it into his pocket. Haven Brew Cafe, Linden Avenue. "Mommy makes the best hot chocolate," Suri added, "with extra marshmallows." The line was finally moving. Leora picked up Suri and stepped into the aisle, then turned back one last time. "She's beautiful, Jalen. Mira, she's really, really beautiful." Leora's voice caught slightly. "And she's lucky to have you, even if it doesn't feel like that right now." Then she was gone, disappearing into the stream of passengers, Suri's sleepy face peering over her shoulder until they vanished from sight. Jalen stood there for a long moment, Mira warm in his arms, the piece of paper burning a hole in his pocket. He was thinking about Alara, about her last words, about the way Mira had stopped crying the moment a stranger held her. He was thinking about grief and the impossible weight of doing everything alone. And he was thinking about a woman with tired eyes who remembered what it felt like. The months that followed were both endless and impossibly fast. Jalen went back to work, back to the routine of daycare drop-offs and late-night feedings and weekend trips to the park, where other parents smiled at him with that particular mix of pity and admiration reserved for single fathers. He got better at the practical things: the bottle temperatures, the sleep schedules, the art of grocery shopping with a baby strapped to his chest. But the loneliness didn't fade. If anything, it grew deeper, settling into the quiet moments when Mira was asleep and the apartment was too still. He kept the receipt in his wallet. He took it out sometimes, late at night, tracing the handwritten letters with his thumb. Haven Brew Cafe, Linden Avenue. Some mornings he would put Mira in her car seat and drive toward that part of town, telling himself he was just exploring. He would park across the street from a small cafe with a green awning and flower boxes in the windows. And he would watch families come and go, couples sharing pastries, mothers meeting for coffee while their children played. He never went inside. 8 months passed. Mira learned to crawl, then to pull herself up on furniture, then to take her first wobbly steps across the living room into Jalen's waiting arms. She learned to say dada and no and more. She was becoming a person, a real person with preferences and opinions and a laugh that sounded like bells. And Jalen loved her so fiercely that sometimes it hurt to breathe. But there were nights when she would cry inconsolably, and nothing Jalen did could calm her down. On those nights, he would hold her and rock her and whisper the same words he had whispered on the plane. "I'm sorry, baby. Daddy's trying." And sometimes, in the darkest hours, he would think about a stranger who had held his daughter for 20 minutes and done what he couldn't do in 20 hours. He thought about that night more than he wanted to admit. He thought about Leora's tired eyes and the way the cabin had gone silent when Mira stopped crying. He thought about her every time he passed a mother and daughter in the grocery store. Every time Mira reached for someone who wasn't him. On the morning of Mira's first birthday, Jalen woke up before dawn. He lay in bed for a long time, listening to Mira babble through the baby monitor, and made a decision. He got up, showered, dressed Mira in her nicest outfit, a yellow dress with little daisies that Alara's mother had sent, and drove across town to Linden Avenue. The cafe was exactly as he remembered it. Green awning, flower boxes, a small chalkboard sign out front. Through the window, he could see mismatched tables and chairs, local art on the walls, the kind of cozy warmth that made you want to stay for hours. And there, behind the counter, was Leora. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in a loose braid, and she was wearing an apron dusted with flour. She was laughing at something the elderly man at the register had said, her whole face transformed by the smile, and Jalen felt his heart do something strange in his chest. He almost turned around. He almost got back in the car and convinced himself that this was a stupid idea, that 8 months was too long, that she wouldn't remember him. But then Mira made a sound. Not a cry, not a laugh, just a small, curious noise. And Jalen looked down at his daughter. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Should we go in?" Mira blinked at him with Alara's eyes and said very clearly, "More." Jalen laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't heard from himself in months. "Okay," he said. "More it is." He pushed open the door. A small bell chimed overhead, and the smell of coffee and fresh bread washed over him. The cafe was half full with the morning crowd, people on laptops, couples sharing breakfast, an older woman reading a newspaper in the corner. No one looked up as Jalen walked in, except for one person. In the far corner, at a small table by the window, sat a little girl with dark curly hair. She was bent over a piece of paper, coloring intently with a crayon. Next to her was an empty chair with a stuffed rabbit propped against the back. Suri. As if sensing his gaze, Suri looked up. Her eyes went wide. Then she let out a shriek that made every head in the cafe turn. "Mommy! Mommy! It's the airplane man! The airplane man with baby Mira!" Leora nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. She spun around, her eyes scanning the cafe until they found Jalen standing by the door, Mira in his arms, looking like he wasn't sure whether to run or stay. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mira wiggled in Jalen's arms, pointing toward Leora with one chubby finger, and made a sound that Jalen had never heard her make before. "Ma," she said. "Mama." Jalen felt the blood drain from his face. "Mira, no, that's not." But Leora was already moving. She set down the coffee pot, came around the counter, and walked toward them with tears streaming down her face. Suri had jumped out of her chair and was running too. "You came," Leora said, stopping just a few feet away. Her voice was shaking. I didn't think, I wasn't going to," Jalen admitted. "About 100 times, I almost didn't." "Then why did you?" Jalen looked at Mira, who was still reaching for Leora, still making that sound. "Ma," like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Because she hasn't stopped talking about you," he said. "I mean, not talking, obviously. But every night before she falls asleep, she makes this humming sound. And it took me weeks to figure out where I'd heard it before." He paused, his throat tight. "It was the song you sang to her on the plane." She remembered. Leora's hand flew to her mouth. "That was my mother's lullaby," she whispered. "She used to sing it to me when I was little. I didn't even realize I was—" "She remembered," Jalen said again. "And so did I." Suri had reached them by now, bouncing on her toes. "Is baby Mira going to play with my toys now? I told her she could. Remember, Mommy?" Leora laughed and bent down to her daughter's level. "I remember, sweetheart. Why don't you show her the corner where we keep the crayons?" Suri's face lit up. She looked at Jalen hopefully. "Can I hold her hand, please? I'll be really careful." Jalen set Mira down on her feet. She was steady now, had been walking for 2 months. "Hi, Mira," Suri said solemnly, extending her small hand. "I'm Suri. We're going to be best friends." Mira studied the offered hand for a moment. Then she reached out and grabbed Suri's fingers, and the two of them toddled off toward the corner table, Suri chattering about all the important things Mira needed to know about crayons. Jalen and Leora stood there, watching them go, standing close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "She called you Mama," Leora said softly. "I know. I'm sorry. She doesn't really understand. Don't apologize." Leora's voice was firm, but there was something fragile underneath it. "My mother used to say that children know things that adults are too scared to see. Maybe she sees something we're not ready to admit yet." Jalen felt the ground shift under his feet. "What are you saying?" Leora took a breath. "I'm saying that for 8 months I've been thinking about a man on an airplane. A man who was so clearly terrified and exhausted and in over his head, but who was also holding his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the universe. I'm saying that Suri asks about you every single day. She draws pictures of the airplane man and baby Mira. And every time I see them, I wonder what would have happened if I had been braver." She stepped closer. "I'm saying that my mother died never knowing if I would find someone. She used to tell me that good men are the ones who stay, not the ones who make promises, not the ones who say the right things, but the ones who stay, even when it's hard, even when they're scared." She reached up and touched Jalen's face, her palm warm against his cheek. "You stayed," she said. For 8 months you've been doing this alone, and you stayed. For your daughter, for Alara, for yourself. And now you're here, and my daughter is teaching your daughter how to draw butterflies. And I don't know what happens next. But I know. What? Jalen managed. What do you know? I know that when you walked through that door, I finally understood what my mother meant. About good men, about staying. She smiled through her tears. I know that I don't want to do this alone anymore, and I don't think you do either. Jalen felt something break open inside him. Not a wound, but a wall. A wall he had built 8 months ago in a hospital room, brick by brick. Every time someone told him he was doing great, every time someone said Alara would be proud, he had built that wall to protect himself, to keep the grief contained. But standing here, in this tiny cafe on Linden Avenue, with this woman who had held his daughter on an airplane and sung her a lullaby and somehow remembered what it felt, like the wall didn't seem so important anymore. I don't know how to do this, he said. His voice cracked. I don't know how to be. I don't know if I can. Neither do I, Leora said. But maybe we can figure it out together. One day at a time, one cup of coffee at a time. She glanced at the corner, where Suri and Mira were now both covered in crayon, giggling at something only they understood. One butterfly drawing at a time. Jalen followed her gaze, watching his daughter laugh with pure, uncomplicated joy. Mira looked up, caught him watching, and she waved. A clumsy, full-arm wave that nearly knocked the crayon out of Suri's hand. Dada, she called out. Dada, look. I see, baby, Jalen called back. I see. The elderly man behind the counter, the cafe owner, Jalen would later learn, a man named Nolan Price, who had known Leora's mother for 40 years, cleared his throat loudly. Hey, Leora, he called out. You going to introduce me to your young man, or should I just keep pretending I'm not watching this whole thing like my favorite soap opera? Leora laughed, wiping her eyes. Nolan, this is Jalen. Jalen, this is Nolan. He's going to give you a free coffee and a muffin because he's a romantic. Nolan snorted. I'm giving him free coffee because anyone who makes you smile like that deserves at least that much. Blueberry or chocolate chip? Chocolate chip, Jalen said automatically. Good answer. Leora, take your break. I'll handle the counter. Leora led Jalen to a small table near the window, across from where Suri and Mira were still creating their masterpiece. This is where my mom used to sit, Leora said, running her hand over the worn wood. Every morning for 20 years, she sat right here with her tea and her crossword puzzle. Nolan keeps the table reserved for her, even now. Jalen looked at the empty chair across from him, and suddenly he understood. This table wasn't just a table. It was a shrine, a memory, a promise. What was her name? He asked. Ruth. Ruth Ellen Foster. Leora smiled, and there was no sadness in it. Just love. Just gratitude. She would have liked you. She would have said you have honest eyes. Do I? The most honest I've ever seen. Nolan appeared with 2 coffees and 2 enormous chocolate chip muffins. He set them down without comment, then retreated with a knowing wink at Leora. So, Leora said, wrapping her hands around her mug. What happens now? Jalen looked at her. This woman who had stepped into his life for 20 minutes on an airplane and somehow changed everything. He looked at the little girls in the corner, already inseparable. He looked at the empty chair where Ruth Ellen Foster used to sit, and thought about Alara, and thought about the way grief and love were sometimes the same thing, just wearing different clothes. Now, he said slowly, I think I'd like to hear about Ruth. And maybe you'd like to hear about Alara. And maybe, if it's okay with you, I'd like to come back tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Until those girls over there are so sick of each other that they're fighting over crayons instead of sharing them. Leora laughed. That wet, wonderful sound again. That might take a while. Suri's pretty stubborn. Good thing I'm not going anywhere. Outside the window, the sun continued to rise. Inside the cafe, two broken people sat across from each other and began, slowly, carefully, to tell each other their stories. In the corner, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old created a drawing that would later be framed and hung on a wall in a house that didn't exist yet. A house with a green door and a backyard, with a swing set and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and fresh bread. But that was later. Right now, there was just this. 2 cups of coffee, 2 chocolate chip muffins, and the sound of children laughing. Right now, there was just Leora's hand reaching across the table and Jalen's hand meeting her halfway, their fingers intertwining like they had always been meant to fit together. Right now, there was just a single dad and a single mom. Both of them tired. Both of them scared. Both of them hoping that maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to do this alone anymore. And in the corner, Mira looked up from her drawing, saw her father holding hands with the woman from the airplane, and smiled. It was a smile that looked exactly like Alara's smile. That smile that Jalen had been so afraid of losing. But he realized now that he hadn't lost it at all. He had just been waiting for the right moment to see it again. Dada? Mira said, pointing at her drawing. Look, family. Jalen looked at the paper, a chaotic mess of color that might have been 4 stick figures if you squinted hard enough. He looked at Suri, who was nodding proudly. He looked at Leora, who was crying again, but smiling too. Yeah, Mira, he said, his voice thick with something that felt like hope. Family. Nolan watched from behind the counter. He thought about Ruth Ellen Foster, about the way she used to sit at that table every morning and tell him that someday her Leora would find her person. Took your time, didn't you? He murmured to the ceiling, to wherever Ruth was watching from. But I guess you always did have a flair for the dramatic. Because sometimes the unthinkable isn't something terrible. Sometimes the unthinkable is simply this: a stranger who sees your struggle and chooses to help. A hand reaching out across an aisle. A lullaby remembered from childhood. A piece of paper with an address scribbled on the back. Sometimes the unthinkable is love, arriving when you least expect it, in the form you least expect, from the person you would never have thought to look for. And sometimes all it takes is a baby who won't stop crying, and a single mother who does the unthinkable.